This legislation doesn't do anything to help the 23 million Americans looking for good-paying jobs. Vote no on this turkey of a piece of legislation.
What purpose is the gentleman from Minnesota rise?
Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the Chairman, and Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of preventing greater uncertainty in Labor Management Relations Act. Listen, if you're sick of government, spend a couple years here. And we talk about the American people, please tell me that these debates have anything to do with getting people back to work. This is about a constitutional process that we're supposed to follow. This is about unconstitutional appointments to the National Labor Relations Board. That board, by the way, protects employers, management, and labor. Okay, it's not just labor. So let's make sure we understand that. As we come here and do this posturing, no wonder the American people are losing faith in the way this body works. If we're really concerned about getting people back to work, if we're really concerned about letting this nation rise again, this is not a Republican issue or a Democrat issue. This is not a board that's supposed to be made up of all Republicans or all Democrats, but it's supposed to be constitutionally appointed. My Lord, what are we talking about today? These are unconstitutional appointments. You know what the certainty of this is? Here's the certainty. Because of the way the President has acted, and this is a President that always talks about, you know what, if you play by the rules, if you follow the rules and you work really hard, in this country you have a chance to make it. But the little thing down the footnote is, unless you don't agree with me, and then I'll go ahead and do it the way I want to do it, even though I'm a professor of constitutional law, put that aside. I know an end run on this. Now, I would tell my colleagues, please, this is a process that we have to protect. This is not a political football to go back and forth with. My goodness. This is about fairness. Fairness is not a Republican issue or a Democrat issue. It's an American issue. And it doesn't matter this who struck John, what did past presidents do. This has been found unconstitutional. Now, the only certainty of what's going on here, 3 things are certain regarding the board's current decisions. Those decisions cannot be relied upon. Every losing party will be justified in filing an appeal, and no prevailing party can be assured that they will ever benefit from any board-ordered remedy. How do you fix it?
Gentleman's
Take it to the Senate, get them
another 30 seconds.
Get it, go ahead, run it through the process it's supposed to run through, get them appointed the right way, and then go forward. Isn't that the American way? I'm not talking about a Republican way. Rob, I'm not talking about a Democratic way. What's best for the country? What's best for the country? This political posturing is ridiculous. We know what the law is here. We know what the process is. We know what the Constitution says. And to be here today making it into something else, this is not about class warfare. This is about denying the process. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey.
Speaker, I yield myself 20 seconds. My friend talks about playing by the rules. President Obama followed the rules that President Reagan followed, President Bush followed, President Clinton followed, President George W. Bush followed. The other body has the ability to resolve this dispute by taking votes on the 5 nominees that are presently before the United States Senate. I reserve the balance of my time. At this time, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to a consistent voice for America's working families across the country, the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 1 minute.
I thank my good friend.
For 1 minute.
I thank my good friend. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend. I thank my good friend, and I'm so glad my good friend talked about the question of fairness, because I believe in fairness as well, and I ask my colleagues to enthusiastically, with great presence, to vote this legislation down because it is unfair. Because I believe in the working man and working woman and working families who desperately need a fair body that is in order, in regular order, the NLRB, that allows companies, corporate America, to come to the table of reconciliation on issues like pay equity, which my good friend Rosa DeLauro championed, and I'm joining her, on good issues like the quality of life in the workplace, the idea of income and negotiations on plants being shut down. And what my good friends want to do is deny the process to this president that Ronald Reagan used some 240 times, the hundreds of recess appointments in the 1980s to ensure that regular order occurred in this nation on behalf of the working men and women of America. This is a direct stab at them. This is a direct undermining of them, and I would ask my colleagues to vote against this and for the working men and women of America. This is a bad bill. I yield back.
Gentleman from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am now pleased to yield to a member of the committee 3 minutes to the gentleman from Indiana, the other gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Rokita.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 3 minutes.
Well, I thank the Speaker. I thank the Chairman for yielding. You know, I'm struck by the gentlelady who just spoke, her mention of fairness. What is fair is the rule of law, and that's what this country was founded upon. That is the ultimate fairness, and that's what this bill is fundamentally about, the core American value about respect for the rule of law. Now, our President chose to violate the law by unconstitutionally appointing new members to the National Labor Relations Board in January of 2012. And while the President claimed he had this authority, and while our friends here are claiming he had this authority because the Senate was, quote, in recess, unquote, there was one problem. The Senate wasn't in recess. The Senate was actually in session. Last year, in response to this, I led a letter to our President with 26 of our colleagues, Mr. Speaker, protesting these appointments and asking the White House to obey the law so that we wouldn't have the uncertainty that we do now, so that we wouldn't have to have the argument that we're having now, unfortunately. But by making these appointments, while the White House and the executive branch has essentially claimed the authority to determine when the Senate is unavailable to perform its constitutional duties. Now, the executive branch should not be deciding whether the Senate is unavailable to provide its advice and consent. Our founding fathers, who created a government marked by a separation of powers, would be shocked and dismayed by the utter disregard the President has shown to the Constitution of the United States by making these appointments. Now, Mr. Speaker, with all due respect to my colleagues on the other side who have continually made this argument as if they said it 20 times, it actually makes it more true. It does not. The suggestion that President Obama's actions were similar to past presidents is patently false. No president, and I repeat, Mr. Speaker, no president ever made recess appointments while the Senate was meeting regularly in pro forma session until this current president. If President Obama had followed the practice set by his predecessors, there wouldn't be a cloud of uncertainty hanging over the NLRB today. And this uncertainty, to the point made by my colleagues earlier, is hurting jobs. This uncertainty, because when you have commissioners who are appointed unconstitutionally, their rules are now unconstitutional. Businesses can't follow them. Unions can't follow them. Workers can't follow them. And when that's the case, what job creator is going to hire more people? And that's the real situation we find ourselves in here today, unfortunately. Now the issue is pending before the United States Supreme Court. It is my hope that the Court will acknowledge that no one, including this President, Mr. Speaker, is above the law in this country, from the poorest of our citizens
Gentleman's time is
to himself.
30 seconds.
And we cannot,
recognized for 30 seconds.
And we can never afford to forget that. For these reasons, I simply urge all my colleagues to support H.R. 1120, to not listen to the nonsense that we're hearing from the other side. We believe in the worker. We believe in workers' rights. We believe in the rights of businesses. We believe in the rights of unions. We believe the President, above everyone else in this country, should follow the law. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 20 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the prior Speaker's own words indicate the contradiction of his position. He said it is unconstitutional that these recess appointments took place. He then just said that the appeal of this matter is pending before the United States Supreme Court. Marbury versus Madison does not give the D.C. Circuit the final say on constitutionality. It gives the Supreme Court that authority. At this time, I'm pleased to yield to someone who has made a career here fighting for the rights of working Americans and collective bargaining, the gentlelady from Connecticut, Ms. DeLauro, for 2.5 minutes.
The gentlewoman from Connecticut is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
I rise in strong opposition to this ill-conceived bill. It aims to effectively shut down the National Labor Relations Board, another direct attack by this House majority on workers' rights. As we have been debating, a D.C. court recently ruled that 2 of the board's current appointments made during a recess within the congressional session are invalid, and therefore NLRB currently lacks a quorum. This ruling is at odds with 3 other court rulings on the same matter. And in fact, the court did not order the NLRB to stop performing its duties. Nevertheless, the majority is trying to use this one decision as a pretext to stop the board from issuing any decisions or taking any other actions on behalf of workers. It is a transparent attempt to effectively shut down the NLRB. What we need to do here is have the Senate take up the 5 pending nominations and act quickly so that we can have a functioning NLRB. This one-court decision is squarely at odds with long-standing practice. Presidents of both parties have routinely made recess appointments during intra-session recesses and without regard to when the vacancy first arose. The Congressional Research Service has identified a total of 329 intra-session research appointments made since 1980. All of these would presumably be invalid under this court's decision. And that includes 4 such NLRB recess appointments by President Reagan and 4 by the second President Bush. Tell me, were these 8 appointments by President Reagan and President Bush also in violation of the Constitution? If so, then why is this one particular court decision considered, quote, the right one, despite the fact that all other courts and past practices disagree with it? The majority simply wants to prevent the NLRB from functioning so that workers who want to evoke their basic right to organize have no recourse. What recourse, for that matter, would employers have against actions by unions that violate labor laws, such as secondary boycotts or unlawful picketing? Under the terms of the National Labor Relations Act, its provisions can only be enforced through the NLRB. There is no provision in the Act for private lawsuits.
Gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, I yield the gentlelady another 30 seconds.
Thank you. Without the NLRB, we simply do not have a fair workplace that works for everyone. This is another in the endless series of Republican attacks on the foundations of the American middle class. It aims to undermine worker protections and accelerate a race to the bottom. Let the NLRB do its work. I urge my colleagues to stand up for workers and employers and oppose this bill.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Minnesota.
Mr. Speaker, can I inquire as to the time remaining?
The gentleman from Minnesota has 6.5.
The gentleman from Minnesota has 6.5 minutes. The gentleman from New Jersey has 5.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have another speaker reportedly en route from another committee, and so I'll reserve my time and give him a
gentleman
chance.
reserves his time. The gentleman from New Jersey.
I thank my friend, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at this time I'm pleased to yield to someone who's walked in the shoes of those collectively bargaining and organizing. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, for 1.5 minutes.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I oppose H.R. 1120, and this is just a naked attempt to neuter the National Labor Relations Board. This is done in concert with the United States Senate, which refuses to confirm any nominees by the President to the NLRB, and in concert also with the right-wing ideologues on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, who have gone against 150 years of practice by Democratic and Republican presidents alike in appointing through the recess appointment constitutional process. Now we have the U.S. Congress, the House of Representatives, with this H.R. 1120, Preventing Greater Uncertainty in Labor Management Relations Act. This would straitjacket workplace fairness and hurt middle-class workers. It would also create uncertainty, interfere with judicial proceedings still on appeal, and undermine the NLRB's core functions. This is a bill that's anti-worker, it's obstructionist, and it represents the machinations of the Republican Party more interested in impeding the NLRB and blindly attacking this administration at every opportunity than finding solutions to unemployment. This bill represents a party that has lost touch with middle-class values, and I urge my colleagues to vote against it.
Gentleman from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would advise my colleague that the speaker we're waiting for has not yet arrived. I'm not sure how many speakers left on your side.
The gentleman continue to reserve.
I continue to reserve. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, I would advise my friend and the Speaker that we have no more speakers at this time. What I'd propose, with the Speaker's discretion, is I'd like to speak for about a minute. Perhaps if your other speaker arrives, we could accommodate that person. If not, I would then close for our side, and then the chairman defending the bill would close.
I have no objection.
I yield myself 1 minute, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
The House deserves an accurate record of where this matter stands legally. After the Senate refused to cast a vote on any of the President's nominees to the National Labor Relations Board, the President acted through the Recess Appointments Clause that his predecessors have relied on far more often than he has. The D.C. Circuit ruled that those appointments were invalid. The case is presently under consideration under writ of certiorari to the United States Supreme Court, which either will or will not hear the appeal. The majority is advancing the rather novel legal theory that a decision by one circuit court of appeals establishes with finality the constitutionality or lack of constitutionality of a provision. This is truly a novel theory. Marbury versus Madison makes it clear. Only the United States Supreme Court has finality in these sort of matters. The President acted in good faith under a constitutional provision that others have followed before.
Gentleman from Minnesota.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our speaker has not yet arrived, so I'll be ready to close after the gentleman from New Jersey. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, I claim as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
I thank the Speaker and colleagues of both parties for the spirited nature of this debate. At its core, this debate and this bill is about the primacy and value of collective bargaining in our country. There really are two different points of view in collective bargaining. One is that it's a nuisance. The other is it's an engine of economic growth. There are those who believe that the proper organization of our economy is that the bosses decide what happens, everyone else salutes, and that's what happens. This led us to situations where we had children working in sweatshops, people working 80 or 90 or 100 hours a week, people being forced out and fired for all sorts of invalid and irrational reasons. In our country's history, we're fortunate that there was a great movement of collective bargaining among the working people of this country. And in the 1930s, those who preceded us here enshrined the rights of collective bargaining in various statutes. Since then, for nearly 90 years, these statutes have worked to promote fairness, equity, and economic growth in our country. Collective bargaining works, not just for those in a union, but for all those in the United States of America. This bill is a direct assault on collective bargaining. It is an assault that has seen its manifestation in other parts of the country, against public workers in Wisconsin, against all workers in Ohio. Collective bargaining is one of the main engines of the development of America's middle class. And America's middle class is clearly the main reason for the development of the strongest economy on the face of the earth. A vote against this bill is an affirmation of the value of collective bargaining. A vote for this bill is an erosion of that precious right that Americans have always enjoyed and should enjoy. We have the opportunity to stand up for those who wash the dishes, patrol the streets, build our buildings, teach our children. We have the opportunity to stand up for the right of collective bargaining. I urge both my Republican and Democratic friends to stand up for America's middle class and vote no on this bill that paralyzes and assaults collective bargaining in our country. I yield back the balance of our time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's important to remember why we're here today. More than a year ago, the President took an unprecedented step despite all of the discussion from the other side of the aisle. No other President made a recess appointment when the Senate was in session, in pro forma session, or any session. So despite how many times President Reagan or President George H.W. Bush or President George W. Bush made recess appointments, this was unprecedented. Now, it's still an open question to be decided. The D.C. Court of Appeals made a ruling that the President's appointees to the National Labor Relations Board were unconstitutional. And it's going to be an ongoing debate, I'm sure, going forward for days and weeks, sooner the better, to determine what it means under Article 1, Section 5, Clause 2 of the United States Constitution, where it says the Senate is vested with the power to, quote, determine the rules of its proceedings. The Senate determined that the rules of its proceedings said that the Senate was in session. We heard mentioned today by a number of my colleagues that Senator Reid had announced when President Bush was in office that the Senate was going to stay in pro forma session in order to keep the President from making recess appointments. That's an important debate going forward. But the problem is, as we stand here today with a lot of discussion from the other side of the aisle, unfortunately some of which was questioning our motives, my motives, call action shameful. That's a shame. Because what we've got today is a board who has been ruled unconstitutional by the D.C. Court, which, by the way, is the court that reviews every single challenge to an NLRB ruling. You can't get relief by a court in San Diego. If you don't like the ruling of the board, you're going to appeal to the court who has already ruled that that board is unconstitutional. This is dysfunctional. This doesn't have anything to do with whether or not I or anybody else believes in collective bargaining rights. We have a board that under the National Labor Relations Act is supposed to be an arbiter, a fair arbiter. It's the place where you go to get a determination. And the problem today is you can't go there and get a determination. Or you get one that is immediately suspect and open to appeal to a court who's already said that they're unconstitutional. We already have over 600 rulings by this board since these appointments were made January a year ago. Every time this board makes another decision, another ruling, it pours more uncertainty into an economy that is frankly still desperately struggling to come out. We've heard accusations about, well, it's the Senate's fault, and I'm sort of inclined to always think that it's the Senate's fault when something doesn't happen. But just to remind my colleagues that this is a bipartisan Senate problem. In 2011, a Republican board nominee languished in the Democrat-led Senate for a year. No hearing, no debate, no vote. So this is not a new circumstance. There is an answer to this. The President of the United States can bring forward nominees that can be confirmed. That can be confirmed, and then we would have a constitutionally constituted board to go forward and resolve the disputes that were brought up so many times by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. But that's not what we have now. We have a dysfunctional board that is worse than useless because they're making decisions which are entirely suspect. So, Congress should not allow this situation to get worse. The Preventing Greater Uncertainty in Labor Management Relations Act is an appropriate response to a horrible situation. This ought not to be Republicans versus Democrats. This is a chance for us to say we have an intolerable situation. This board needs to stop issuing decisions that are immediately suspect and challengeable to the very court that has ruled them unconstitutional. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on H.R. 1120, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 146, the previous question is ordered on the bill as amended. The question is on engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
A bill to prohibit the National Labor Relations Board from taking any action that requires a quorum of the members of the board until such time as board constituting a quorum shall have been confirmed by the Senate. The Supreme Court issues a decision on the constitutionality of the appointments to the board made in January 2012, or the adjournment sine die of the first session of the 113th Congress.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Illinois rise?
Mr. Speaker, I have a motion to recommit.
Is the gentlewoman opposed to the bill?
I am opposed.
The gentlewoman qualifies. The clerk will report the motion.
Ms. Bustos of Illinois moves to recommit the bill, H.R. 1120, to the Committee on Education and the Workforce with instructions to report the same back to the House forthwith with the following amendment. At the end of the bill, insert the following. Section 5. Protecting the employment and election rights of veterans and the American workforce against outsourcing, abuse by foreign firms, unsafe working conditions, and discrimination. This act shall not apply to any case or matter before the National Labor Relations Board involving any of the following. 1. Any former members of the armed forces fired from a job in violation of the National Labor Relations Act or the processing of an election for representation for collective bargaining sought by any former member of the armed forces. 2. Any attempt by the U.S. employer to outsource jobs or work overseas in violation of such act. 3. Any violation by an employer that is a foreign-owned firm against the rights of American workers under such act. 4. Workers seeking good faith bargaining under such act to address issues related to health and safety, including hazardous working conditions involving underground mines, exposure to toxic chemicals, or explosions. 5. Workers seeking good faith bargaining under such act to address discrimination based on age, sex, disability, race, religion, or other personal characteristics. 6. Any employer found to have violated child labor laws during the 5-year period before the case or matter involving such employer comes before the board.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlewoman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is the final amendment to the bill. It will not delay or kill the bill or send it back to committee. If adopted, the bill will proceed immediately to final passage as amended. This past November, Illinoisans and people across our country sent a strong but simple message to Congress that the middle class needs to be a priority, not an afterthought. The people I talk with back home are worn out by Washington putting politics before people. And I was honored to take my oath of office in January with a mission to be part of the solution here in Congress. Like so many other members of the freshman class of this session of Congress, I ran for office to fight for the American worker and for a stronger middle class. I believed I could make a difference, and I still do. The hardworking middle-class people from my district in Illinois are counting on us to remember them as we deliberate in this chamber. That begins with standing up against attempts to cut the legs out from beneath American workers, which is exactly what this bill does that's being presented today. Mr. Speaker, without the support of organized labor, my family wouldn't be where we are today. My father-in-law, Joe, was born in a boxcar to immigrant parents from Mexico. With just an 8th grade education, he worked the line at John Deere Harvester Works in East Moline, Illinois. And because of organized labor, he earned an honest wage and benefits for his hard work. He was able to provide for his family and make sure his 4 children had a better life and more opportunities than he did. Joe's youngest son is Jerry, my husband, who with the help of organized labor has helped lift our own family to success. I'm proud of my husband's nearly 30-year law enforcement career, and he is now the undersheriff of Rock Island County, where I live, and the commander of the Quad Cities Bomb Squad. I know my family story is not unique about how organized labor helped lift us, and that so many American families share this same type of experience. Far too many people across this great nation of ours are still struggling, but are still hopeful that if they work hard and play by the rules, they too can live the American dream. Unfortunately, the bill before us today tells American workers they're on their own. Instead of adding certainty and stability to our communities, this bill creates chaos and undermines decades of progress. My amendment pleads for just a morsel of common sense. It provides a few simple but critical exceptions to the chaos that the bill otherwise promises. It protects workers who have risked their lives for our country on the battlefields abroad. These are heroes like Clarence Adams, who was among the first American Marines to set foot on Iraq 10 years ago. After Clarence returned home, he tried to exercise his right to organize at his workplace. The election was held, the union won, and then the union busting began. Clarence and 21 of his fellow workers were even fired at one point. He had one place to go, and that was to turn to the National Labor Relations Board. Voting for this bill means stripping away those rights for Clarence and countless other brave veterans. My amendment would protect the rights of veterans to organize in the workplace. As far too many hardworking families across our nation feel each day, our economy is healing. And I pledge to fight for the American worker, and that's a pledge I am committed to keeping. The middle class is stronger because of organized labor. If a company takes American jobs and outsources them overseas simply to avoid the formation of a union, that must not be allowed. My amendment would protect these jobs. If a foreign company abuses our American workers' rights, we need a strong NLRB to stand up for them, and my amendment does this. If American workers face dangerous working conditions that could cost them their lives, and they seek the right to organize for their own protection, we need the NLRB to function on their behalf. If a person faces sexual harassment at the workplace, or a worker faces racial discrimination, they should be allowed to join with their coworkers so they can address these issues. My amendment gives these workers a voice. The NLRB was created to decide cases on a fair and an independent basis, and this has traditionally been made up of both Republicans and of Democrat board members. It is there to fight for the rights of workers and the middle class against the worst abuses. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote yes, to put aside partisanship and begin focusing on the middle class.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota rise?
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the motion to recommit.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is an interesting political stunt. Our friends on the other side had ample opportunity, both in committee markup and before the Rules Committee, to offer an amendment of this nature. They did not. It does nothing to fix the problem that we are faced with today. Making an exception in statute that says a board that has been ruled unconstitutional can act anyway for some people and not for others, frankly, makes no sense. I'll stand behind no one in my desire to protect our men and women in uniform, those who are serving and those who have served, but that's not what this motion to recommit is really about. Our bill brings certainty and an impetus to our friends at the other side of the Capitol to move with the President to fix a dysfunctional National Labor Relations Board that can address the very issues that my colleagues have brought up. So I urge defeat of the motion to recommit and support the underlying bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back without objection. The previous question is ordered on the motion to recommit. The question is on the motion. All those in favor will say aye. Those opposed say no. In my opinion, the noes have it. The motion is not agreed to.
Mr. Speaker, may I ask for the yeas and nays?
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote. Pursuant to Clause 8 and Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on the motion to recommit will be followed by 5-minute votes on passage of the bill, if ordered, and approval of the journal. This is a 15-minute vote.
The House wrapping up its work week by debating a bill that would limit the authority of the National Labor Relations Board. The bill would bar actions by the NLRB that require a quorum unless the Senate confirms additional members or the Supreme Court upholds President Obama's recess appointments. The legislation stems from a D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals ruling in January that declared the President's 3 appointments of 2012 to the board unconstitutional and in violation of the President's authority to make recess appointments because the Senate had not actually gone into recess. Josh Hicks from the Washington Post writes that the President made his NLRB recess appointments at a time when the Senate Republicans were making frequent use of the filibuster to prevent his nominees from being confirmed. He writes that Republicans have argued that no other president has made a recess appointment during a break of less than 10 days, but GOP lawmakers at the time were holding pro forma sessions every 3 days to avoid reaching the 10-day mark. This is a vote on the motion to recommit made by Cheri Bustos, Democrat of Illinois, dealing with the right of veterans to organize in the workplace. Over in the Senate, well, the Senate is out today after yesterday agreeing to move forward on debate on gun control legislation, which is likely to begin next week. The Senate is back Monday. We may see debate beginning on Tuesday, and that would start with the compromise agreement on background checks, expanded background checks for gun purchases. We spoke about that and the upcoming debate with a Capitol Hill reported this morning on Washington Journal.
O'Keefe is a congressional reporter for the Washington Post. Thanks for being here.
Great to be with you.
Covering this gun legislation issue. What's the significance of Thursday's vote?
The significance is that the Senate's going to talk, and then that's basically it. I mean, at this point, the debate will begin Tuesday afternoon on a series of measures. They'll start with the big one that was announced this week that was struck between Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Senator Patrick Toomey of Pennsylvania, that would expand the background check program to just about every commercial sale and exempt most private sales. A lot of senators said throughout the week that this was something that they needed in order to vote to proceed to a formal debate of the actual legislation, and it's expected that that proposal would have enough. The question then becomes what other amendments will be considered. We believe that the controversial assault weapons ban will be the second amendment proposed, simply so that Democrats can hold that vote and move on. There's a proposal from Senators Patrick Leahy and Susan Collins to make some changes to parts of the bill regarding gun trafficking, or the practice of knowingly buying a weapon for someone who's not supposed to have one. And from there, who knows? I mean, we could see all sorts of different ideas regarding perhaps reciprocity of concealed carry permits across the country. Maybe some changes to how the government pays for and supports mental health support programs across the country. But we expect weeks of debate on this, at least the balance of April, maybe into May as well. There is a recess at the end of April, first few days of May. If they don't finish it by then, they'll come back to it once they return later in May.
And O'Keefe with the Washington Post, tell us about this first step, this amendment by Senator Manchin of West Virginia, Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania. How does it get included now, and what are the discussions going on about it?
Sure. Well, what they will do is they'll bring it up Tuesday. It'll be essentially, they'll have debate on it. They'll have an up or down vote on it at some point. It's believed, now that the text is out there, that they'll have enough support to proceed. As both Manchin and Toomey said, look, I am concerned about any infringement on Second Amendment rights. What we have written would not do that. And that is seen as a signal to like-minded senators of both parties to say, look, there's enough in here that you can support We have made sure that there's nothing being done that would seize weapons or make it difficult for someone to buy one. They're also pushing the fact that this will make it much more equitable for gun dealers, licensed gun dealers, versus people who sell weapons at gun shows, because there are certain things that don't happen at gun shows that must happen at a gun shop, and they're saying we're trying to sort of equal that playing field, and that also is seen as appealing to a few senators.
Has Majority Leader Harry Reid given any indication of whether there will be a limit on the number of amendments or whether he'll take very many from Republican quarters?
Yeah, that's a big unknown. And I think there were enough Republicans who voted for this on the assumption that he's just about going to allow everything. And I think he understands that not only are Republicans interested in that, but there are enough Democrats interested in that, because you know, guns is an issue that breaks down really more over geography than ideology. You've got a lot of Democrats facing re-election next year in more rural and Midwestern and Western states, guys like Mark Begich of Alaska, Mark Pryor of Arkansas, Max Baucus of Montana, Mary Landrieu of Louisiana, Kay Hagan of North Carolina. They need to be able to show their constituents back home that they were part of a fair and open and exhaustive debate on this issue, so that just about every single proposal out there is considered, and then in the end, you know, depending on what's in the final bill, they'll cast a vote. I think Reid understands that enough of those Democrats are going to say you have to at least allow certain votes on some of the most controversial amendments on either side of the issue in order to get my vote. And so he has said most of this week, if you have an idea to strengthen or weaken this law, bring it forward. But if Republicans start to present some, you know, amendments that are seen as poison pills or ways to really strike down most of the law, then you might see Democrats step in and say, hold on a second, let's not do that.
And you mentioned they'll come from both sides of the process, and Senator Reid did say yesterday that we will see an assault weapons ban as part of this process, an amendment that will come forward. What do you expect to happen with that?
We expect it won't get much more than 40 votes. He has already said that he didn't think it will have much more than that. The other controversial proposal that is sought by gun control groups is one that would limit the size of ammunition magazines. A lot of states have now passed limits on the sizes, New York, Connecticut, Colorado, most notably Maryland. But a federal ban on the size, or federal restrictions on the size is likely also going to fail. But at least those Democrats supporting those measures and the various gun control groups can say, well, we tried. And the President has asked for that as well. Everyone will remember his dramatic turn during the State of the Union where he said all of these different proposals deserve a vote. They'll get a vote, but they're not expected to pass.
Ed O'Keefe, we see in Congress relatives of victims of people killed at Sandy Hook, also relatives of victims of gun violence in places like Chicago, going door to door, talking to members of Congress, being present in the Senate chamber as floor speeches are happening. How is that momentum going to be sustained, or will it be sustained? You said that this could take weeks.
Yeah, I think you saw, I believe it was no more than 8 to 10 family members of victims from Newtown, spouses of a few of the teachers, and a sister of one of them, and then a few parents of children who've been most active and vocal from the start and who were here this week. Given that there are weeks to go, and given that there are so many different incidents across the country that have compelled victims' family members to come forward, it's likely that we'll see rounds of them come every week. You know, there are enough groups, and there are enough incidents, and there are enough people interested in talking that we'll likely see them. I suspect as we get closer to a final passage, you'll see a much more dramatic showing of them. The families of the Newtown victims spent most of their time camped outside the chambers in Connecticut when the state legislature there passed their bill. I suspect as we get closer to the finish line, they will do something similar up here, simply because it was such a dramatic demonstration of their push for this. And to put themselves in front of lawmakers, I think, you know, if they can do that to some extent up here, they will do it. Senator Blumenthal, Senator Murphy, both of them of Connecticut, others have said that the most powerful advocate for this right now are the parents of those children. Would be the parents of Hadiya Pendleton, for example, that 15-year-old who had marched in the inaugural parade and then was killed a week later in Chicago. That when the parents of the children affected by this come forward and try to talk to senators, you know, that seems to work. A lot of senators have taken the meeting. Even Harry Reid said yesterday, I didn't want to meet with these people because I knew it would be a very difficult meeting. But I did, and they made their point. And some of the meetings have gone very well. Others, we've been told, have been a little more emotional.
We saw Republicans voting to move forward. Some of them did vote to proceed. Do we expect to see any sort of oral filibuster, any sort of stalling on the Senate floor?
Well, that was what we were expecting this week. There had been a threat from at least 14 Senate Republicans, led by Mike Lee of Utah, Rand Paul of Kentucky, Ted Cruz of Texas, Marco Rubio of Florida, and Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader. They had threatened to filibuster this, but so quickly did 16 Republicans come forward to say, no, I'm not going to stand in the way of debating this, that they dropped that plan. We also anticipated last night that they might have tried to force 30 hours of debate on proceeding to the actual bill. These are the crazy Senate procedures we have. They said, no, go ahead, get started on Tuesday. At some point, depending on how the amendment process goes, we suspect that they will at some point try to do something. But again, the longer Harry Reid allows debate to go, the more amendments he permits to have an up or down vote, the more likely they are to hold off. And, you know, Mike Lee, especially this week, has come forward and said, look, all we're trying to do is make sure that there's thoughtful consideration of this and that Second Amendment rights aren't infringed upon. If that happens, perhaps they'll hold off. Jeff Flake, who voted for proceeding, Republican from Arizona, said yesterday, look, for me this was about process, this wasn't about politics. Harry Reid told me there would be an open amendment process. I trust there will be. As long as there is, I'm all for proceeding.
Ed O'Keefe, Washington Post congressional reporter. Let's go to the phones and hear from Wayne in Charleston, West Virginia, Republican caller. Hi, Wayne.
How are you today? Thank you for accepting the call.
Thanks. Go ahead.
Doing well.
Yes, the reason I was calling in, it's not the guns that's killing people. It's the culture that's been generated in this country. Just same thing with DUIs and vehicles. Are they going to ban all the motor vehicles in this country because the people get killed with them?
Well, Wayne, you know, several Republican senators, and Democratic senators for that matter, have made that point this week, that this isn't just about guns, it's also about mental health, it's about mass violence, and that's part of the reason why the Manchin-Toomey agreement that will be voted on next week includes the establishment of a commission on mass violence. This was an idea that actually was put forth by Joe Lieberman before he retired in January, and Joe Manchin picked it up and got it inserted into this. It'll basically perform like the Super Committee did, or like the 9/11 Commission did back in the day, where they will impanel maybe about a dozen experts on mental health, on guns, on school safety, members of the entertainment industry to come together and put forth some proposals on what else Congress could do beyond just restricting firearms. The thought is that they'll present some recommendations at some point later and that Congress would then give them an up or down vote. Now, in the politics of today, it's likely that Congress would reject them, but perhaps some lawmakers will pick up specific proposals and try to push those through in the years to come. But Manchin and Toomey especially, I remember in a conversation yesterday with Saxby Chambliss of Georgia as well, they made it clear. The reason they're willing to have a debate is because they know that there will be amendments to address mental health concerns, restricting access to people who aren't supposed to have them, whether they're criminals or whether they're mentally ill, and perhaps some kind of discussion about mass violence in the media that compels a lot of people to do this.
Hope Mills, North Carolina. Felix is on the line. He's a Democrat. Go ahead, Felix.
Mr. O'Keefe, C-SPAN in America. Good morning. How are you on this beautiful day?
Doing well.
Outstanding. I'm glad to hear it. The best country in the world, and I'm glad we're able to talk without getting shot at by the government. I've got a couple of things. I'm 100% disabled, so please bear with me. First of all, the constitutional amendment restricts the government powers over the people. But it's my understanding that only the Second Amendment has the two words incorporated, well regulated, into the actual language, which does give the government ability to do something. Number two, law-abiding citizens' rights are being infringed by background checks. My question is, how do I know that you're a law-abiding citizen? And that brings up number three. Adam Gadan, Al-Qaeda spokesman and the top 10 FBI most wanted list, has a YouTube video out expressing the exploitations of no background checks so that they can get weapons to attack America with. And my last one here is that I've lived in America my whole life. I'm right here next to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, home of Special Ops. And I'll be honest with you, anywhere in America, being in a good capitalistic society, I can get me a firearm, either legal or illegal, within an hour. Why don't you give me a comment on those, because I haven't heard anybody ever speaking on those terms. And America, y'all have a great day, because this is good to be an American.
Well, Felix, the three things you brought up there, I think it was three, are essentially the parameters of what you'll hear discussed in the coming weeks as senators have their way. You know, concerns about the expanse and the purpose of background checks, concerns about the availability of weapons on the streets, concerns that, as you pointed out, and there's been a lot of talk about that video clip this week, the terrorists are somehow trying to or have exploited the loopholes. And then a broader discussion about, about mental health concerns. So you encapsulated it beautifully, and I can tell you that lawmakers are hearing those types of concerns and very eager to talk about them.
Trenton, North Carolina. Jerry, independent caller. Go ahead, Jerry.
Yes, my point here is that the gun legislation that they're talking about is starting to slip over from being a Second Amendment infringement to being a Fourth Amendment infringement, because when you're starting to look into people's personal lives, you're starting to infringe upon their right to privacy. And that's an area they don't want to get into also, because that's the other issue with the gun registry that everybody's concerned about. I myself personally, I'm a gun owner. State of North Carolina, we have background checks for any firearm purchases, and that takes place at all gun shows. There's always a deputy there to do the background check on the spot. And we don't have issues like this. You know, we're law-abiding citizens, and we follow the laws and the rules, and we don't have the issues that it seems like other states have with the mass murders going on. And it's like the other man said, what are you going to do about the people that's out there driving drunk? Are you going to ban cars? What if somebody takes a broomstick and beats somebody half to death with it? That's an assault weapon at that point. I mean, you look at what words they're using there.
Okay, Jerry, let's get a response from Ed O'Keefe.
Well, you mentioned there are concerns about privacy. There's no serious discussion about a gun registry, but there are concerns about the possibility of what happens when a state reports that somebody is mentally ill and unable to own or get in touch with a firearm. What happens if, for example, that registry is public and insurance companies start reviewing the registry of people who are prohibited, finds out that somebody that they're covering is on the list, and then begins charging that family a higher premium? So, and that was something that was brought up actually by a senator from your state, Richard Burr, the Republican, who voted to proceed to debate, because he said, that's one issue I'm interested in hearing about. You know, is there a proposal out there that would shield insurers or bar insurers from possibly looking at these lists and finding ways to charge people more money? That's an interesting little wrinkle in this whole debate, and I suspect there'll be some discussion about it.
We see some comments coming in on Twitter relating to this discussion. C-SPAN Junkie says the Second Amendment is the enforcement arm of the Bill of Rights. Cars aren't included in the Second Amendment, so registering a gun leads to confiscation. That's his fear. And then we see a conversation going on about gun shows and what they're really like. Dennis says at every gun show, they walk out to the parking lot and sell out of the trunk with no background check, no nothing. One pays cash, one hands him a gun, and it's done. And that's a concern that some Republican senators opposed to the Manchin-Toomey plan this week pointed out could still happen, because what the plan would do is require background checks on any weapon that is sold over the internet or advertised on the internet or advertised in a newspaper or on a placard somewhere. But anyone just sort of having an email exchange about possibly buying a weapon is exempt from the program. And as one senator pointed out, he said, well, what's to stop someone from going into the gun show, getting the guy's business card, sending him an email and saying, meet me outside an hour after the gun show closes, and then I'll buy the weapon from you? There's a new loophole. It's not so much the gun show loophole, it's the gun show parking lot loophole. And then that's something that they're concerned about. Conversation also on Twitter about the politics of this. Sea of Tranquility writes in and says, you got to figure President Obama is shooting himself in the foot. He could lose a few Senate seats over all this gun talk. And Daryl says House seats maybe, but the majority of America is with him on this, so I don't see a loss of seats in the Senate. Since Daryl brings up the House, let's turn to comments made by Speaker John Boehner yesterday when he was asked in his press briefing if the House would take up this Senate bill.
Our hearts and prayers go out to the families of these victims. And I fully expect that the House will act in some way, shape, or form. But to make a blanket commitment without knowing what the underlying bill is, I think would be irresponsible on my part. Senate has to produce a bill, and I've made clear if they produce a bill, we will review it and take it from there.
Is it your sense that things have changed, though? The mindset of people up here has changed about guns?
Listen, the issue of guns has been an issue for the 22 years that I've been in Congress. And the thing that we have to remember is that laws are only as good as our citizens' willingness to obey them. And law-abiding citizens do, in fact, obey them. Criminals don't obey them. In addition to that, we've got a system of laws that are not enforced today. Now, I would think that before we begin to add more rules and regulations on law-abiding citizens, that we at least expect our law enforcement personnel and the Department of Justice to enforce the current law, which they are not doing.
House Speaker John Boehner. Ed O'Keefe, what might happen in the House?
What's happening in the House is they're staring across the Capitol and waiting to see what's going on in the Senate. Had a conversation with a few Republicans yesterday who might get involved in this once it comes over there, but they said, look, nobody really wants to move until we get a sense of what's realistically possible coming out of the Senate. A lot of members of the House take cues from their state's senators because many of them used to serve in the House, for one thing, and they also have a pretty good gauge of what their state might be amenable to actually moving forward with. The fact that Pat Toomey got involved this week is notable because he hadn't been a player beforehand, but was also important because he is very close to most of Pennsylvania's 13 Republican congressmen, having been one himself previously. And his office said, and a bunch of these guys said, we've been talking to him throughout this whole process. We support what he's doing. We like his plan. We think it's something that actually could work over here in the House. So that was a critical piece because it potentially bought this whole process some time and some political capital in the Republican-controlled House. There are, 3-4 dozen Republican congressmen who represent suburban districts around places like Chicago, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, Cleveland, New York City, Miami, that if they don't engage in some kind of a debate, you could see them face some real problems next year. My colleagues Paul Kane and Philip Rucker, and helped them out with this, looked at this yesterday for today's paper. I think there you are. And it's a fantastic look ahead because what you're potentially seeing now is some pressure put on these suburban House Republicans who the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee already plans to target. And so they may be the ones to tell Speaker Boehner and the House Judiciary Committee, no, we need to debate this. We need to have a conversation about it in the House because if we don't, my political life is on the line and the balance of power in the House could potentially as well.
A tweet following up on what Speaker Boehner had to say. If they don't enforce laws on the federal side like Fast and Furious, what chance is there that they'll abide by their own gun law once it's passed? Well, Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi was asked yesterday during her news conference about those comments Speaker Boehner made regarding law enforcement and the lack thereof. Let's hear her response.
It saddens me because obviously we should enforce the laws that we have. There's no question about that, and many of us have said that over and over again. The most recent Supreme Court decision on guns recognizes that there is a role to be played to regulate, if that's the word, guns, the Heller decision relating to the District of Columbia. But that is not enough. That is not enough. I don't know how we can show our faces to these families or even look ourselves in the mirror if we don't take something more serious. As I've said to you over and over, any one of us as members of Congress, Democratic, Republican, anybody, would stand in front of an assault on our children to protect them from any attack. We should have the political courage to stand out there to protect them from gun violence as well.
Minority Leader Pelosi in the House. Ed O'Keefe, questions being raised over enforcement of existing laws.
That's a big element of this debate. You know, the Justice Department certainly has several different federal gun laws on the books. Republicans and Democrats both point out that enforcement of them hasn't necessarily been as good as it could be. Of course, I think the Justice Department would turn around and say, well, if you gave us more money and manpower, perhaps we would be able to do a better job. But, you know, we'll see whether or not that happens throughout this process. There's been a lot of talk about changing gun laws. I haven't seen any real significant proposal to actually give the Justice Department more hiring ability or more money to work on this while they're also dealing with everything else they deal with. One piece of the Senate plan would give about $40 million to a Justice Department program to help school districts revamp their school security programs, but it doesn't say anything about helping enforce the laws or making sure that DOJ has more money in place. I suspect, especially in the House, once debate really begins over there, that they'll drag in a few Justice Department officials to explain how well they have been prosecuting gun laws on the books and you know, why it is that perhaps they haven't been doing as much as they could.
Let's go to California and hear from Aaron in Ventura, who's a Republican. Hi, Aaron.
Hi, how you doing?
Good.
Hey, thanks for your show. I wish you could move it a little closer to prime time, though, so we don't have to.
I was going to say, you're up early.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask on this whole gun control issue, where I don't understand the logic. I mean, you've got Chicago and New York are perfect examples of any kind of gun control. So where's the logic of any of these arguments that they're bringing up? I mean, I think that it's just another diversion that's created from a you know, a media-fueled knee-jerk reaction to violence close at home, and it just diverts the public's attention.
The nays are 229. The motion is not adopted. The question is on passage of the bill. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. Gentleman from New Jersey.
And a recorded vote.